Hi, I'm Rob Reed. Welcome to my virtual Penguicon panel on editing. I forget what the exact title is that we came up with, but what I'm going to talk about is how you can improve your story through editing. First, let me give you a little background on myself. I'm a professional writer. I've been writing for money for 30 years. I've worked for newspapers, magazines, radio production, done web content, a bunch of stuff. And although fiction writing is different, there's a lot that carries over, from nonfiction as well. On the fiction end, I got back into fiction writing a few years ago after many years off, because when you write for work all day, the last thing you want to do is go home and write fiction. And since then, I've had a few short stories published, and this last summer, I co-edited and published an anthology, Supernatural Streets, which is urban fantasy. Over the years, I've learned a lot about editing and how to improve your stories. And one of the tricks is not just working on other people's stuff, but taking that and learning how to make your own stuff stronger. And that's really going to be my focus. Although a lot of what I'm talking about will actually help if you're working with other writers as an editor. Okay, editing is a very wide term. And just to be clear, what I'm talking about is more on the scale. The scale runs from proofreading, which is, misspelled words and punctuation and grammar, all the way to, complete manuscript revisions. And what I'm talking about is more towards the revision side. Not to say that things like proofreading are not important, because they are, but they come in later in the process, and really you need to get everything else done first. And I do have notes, that's why I'm looking down. It's just a lot to talk about. I can't keep it all in my head. Okay, for the type of editing that I'm talking about, you really need to have a complete draft finished. And sometimes that's a hard part of the process. What I would tell myself when the words weren't coming is, it doesn't have to be good, it just has to be done. This comes from my journalism background, where I had hard deadlines that you had to meet. And you had to write copy, you had to get stuff on paper. Okay? For fiction, it's true. You can't rewrite or edit something until you have it down there to begin with. So first, write your complete draft. Get the whole thing out there. Then once you've done that, you can start working on the editing process. If it's not on the page, you can't fix it. So once I have a complete draft done, I start going through it. I have a very methodical way I do it, which is what I'm going to try to explain to you. There's specific elements I'm looking for. And once again, I'm not really looking at paragraph structure, sentence structure, the use of grammar, punctuation, and things like that. Not yet. That comes a little bit later. My logic is you look at the bigger elements first. Once you've got the major elements of the story right, the smaller things are easier. And if you get really caught up in that revising as you go and making every paragraph the best it can be before you move on, which is a trap that's easy to fall into. I mean, I know I've done it. When you get caught up in that, it wastes time because you're focusing on the small details instead of the big picture. And often, not always, but often, a lot of that little fiddly work you've just done is wasted because you wind up revising that whole section and throwing it out. So don't do the small stuff first, do the big stuff first. So the first thing I look at is the theme of the story. This is after the first draft is done. I may not have known what the theme is going in, and that may be true for you, but once you've got that first draft done, you should have a pretty good idea of what the theme is. Either it's already there in the story, and you just need to make sure that, that it's understandable to the reader, and see if there's anything you need to punch out. Or maybe in the process of editing, you discover the theme. And you go, I didn't realize I was writing about this. And let me talk about what a theme is. The theme and the plot are different. The theme answers the question, what is your story about? Not what happens, that's plot, but what is it about? So the theme is the main idea you're exploring. Some people use the term thematic element for the primary concept, and then there's themes within that, like Lilo and Stitch. The thematic element, or the thematic concept of that movie, excuse me, is family above all others. Some of the individual themes that are explored are loss, grief, forgiveness, responsibility, family duty, and love. So that should help you understand the distinctions between theme, thematic element, and plot. Now, for the rest of this, though, when I say theme, I'm really kind of referring to the thematic element. I'm not going to say thematic element over and over again. I'm just going to call it theme. And again, just to make sure that you understand the difference between plot and theme, the plot of Star Wars is Princess Leia tries to get the Death Star plans to the rebellion so they can destroy the Empire's new weapon. The thematic element, which I'm going to call the theme from now on, is a farm boy transformed by loss undergoes a hero's journey. And then there's sub-themes of loss, wonder, growth, etc. The Force, the concept of the Force, is a recurring theme throughout the Star Wars movie. The Death Star plans are not really a theme. I mean, they come up again and again, so there is a bit of a theme with them. But really what they are is a MacGuffin, which is totally different. They're the plot device that kind of sets the action in motion. They're the thing that everyone wants. The Death Star plans, the Maltese Falcon, the briefcase in Pulp Fiction, those are all MacGuffins. So the plot and the theme are different things, but they're interconnected. The plot is one of the ways you express your theme. So if you're looking at your theme, look at your specific plot points. Do they undercut your theme? Do the characters' actions actually undercut the point you're trying to make, or do they support it? You may need to change the actions of the characters if they undercut it, or you may need to realize that your theme is not what you thought it was. Okay? You'll want to take a look at the actual text here. You don't want to be too on the nose when you're talking about your theme. You don't want to give it away to the reader. And as an example, I do have a story in the anthology I self-published or independent published called Nighthawks. And in that story, I have a former outlaw biker who's paired with an ex-dirty cop. They're recruited by a shadowy government organization to fight monsters. And there's this whole, it's like an 80s buddy cop movie with monsters. So in the first draft, there was a line near the beginning when Frank, the narrator, and he's the dirty cop, is thinking about how he and Tiny, the ex-biker, had been working together for 6 months. They still didn't like each other, but they learned to trust each other. And I had that was in the draft. It was flat out said, wrote the whole story, was working on editing it, and I realized, wait a minute, that is the theme. That is exactly the theme. Hadn't really realized it till I read it. Once I realized that, and the little light bulb went on, I then made changes to the story to support that theme. Originally, they got along much better, because I was thinking in my mind that they were an old established pair. They had a little bantering, but it wasn't really undercutting each other. It was more just friendly bantering. Well, I changed that. I made it more into a bickering and made it more evident that they really didn't like each other. And that Tiny, the guy who'd been doing this longer, really didn't trust Frank, who was the junior partner. And that Frank was still trying to prove himself. These were changes I made deliberately once I realized what the theme was. I actually took out, and this is at the point where I'm still talking about don't make, specific small changes to the text. Well, I took out that line, they did not, yet they trust each other. They did not like each other, but yet they've learned to work together and they trust each other. Well, I took out that they learned to work together and they trust each other because that was explicitly the theme. It was a little small edit, but at that point it was a big edit because it was the key to the story. Then I had to go through and change the interactions, make sure they bickered and not bantered, and I had to add a little bits of business here and there to kind of reinforce the idea. Okay, I think you understand what I'm talking about with theme. And my point was, look specifically for your theme. Identify it, isolate it, make sure your story supports it. Either change the story to fit your theme, Or if you realize the theme is not what you thought it was, kind of change what you know what the theme is to work better with your story. For the rest of this, is a concept that's really important and that most of you probably understand instinctively, but doesn't get talked about a lot. At least I don't think it gets talked about enough. And that is that the reader only sees what you put on the page. They don't see what's in your head. Since you have the whole story in your head, you know everything. You know the character's appearance, you know their motivations, you know their emotions, you know what they're thinking about, you know what they're working about, worried about. You understand it all. However, the reader only knows what you explicitly put on the page. When you're editing your own work, it's so easy to gloss over that because you automatically fill in the blanks. It's much easier when you're editing someone else's work to notice those holes. When I was editing Supernatural Streets, there were a lot of times I'd go to my writers and say, I think I understand what you're trying to do here. You've got A, C, D, E, and I assume there's a B that connects A and C, but I'm not actually seeing it on the page. And they go, well, yeah, that's this. I go, well, can you say it explicitly? Can you make it so the reader doesn't have to guess that there's a missing B? And they go, well, yeah, I guess I just assumed. It's like, yeah, you assumed it because you know, because it's in your own head, because you created the characters. So with your own work, you can still do that. You just got to objectively look at it. And of course, one of the tricks is try to take some time between completing that complete draft, and going in to edit it. The closer you are to when you actually put the last, words on the page, and when you edit it, the more of what's in your head you'll miss when you're going through it. If you've got a few days or a week, or not forever, but a few days, a week, 10 days between the last time you looked at it and when you start to edit it, that's much better. Okay. Because the readers only see what's there. They don't see what you know. So, look at the story. Specifically make sure that your characters' actions and their choices are backed up by what's on the page. So you won't surprise your reader with something that is not set up properly. And that leads me to setups and payoffs. Once again, this is stuff that I'm sure most of you have thought of, but let's talk about it explicitly for a while. A setup is something you establish in the story. A payoff is the completion of that element you set up earlier. Okay? The classic example, and this is the famous example, is Chekhov's gun. And no, I don't mean a phaser. Chekhov the playwright once said something along the lines, and this is not a direct quote, is that if you have a gun on the mantle in Act 1, it should be fired by Act 3. That is, if you set up an expectation for the reader at the beginning, it should be fulfilled by the end. Okay? So, go through your story. Specifically look at your payoffs first. For every little thing that you have that pays off, go through and make sure you set it up earlier. Now, I had this in Nighthawks. I had a character use a Zippo lighter, which is a common, thing that people carry in their pockets. I had him use a Zippo lighter to help escape from some restraints. I don't want to give everything away. Late in the story. And I didn't really think much about it. My first beta reader who read it said, this character doesn't smoke. You'd never establish that he smokes. There's never any mention of this Zippo at all. And you talk about he's got a pistol and he's got a knife, but you never mention the Zippo. And then all of a sudden when he needs it, he reaches into his pocket and there's a lighter. Now, it wasn't a huge thing, but it was a setup, a payoff that wasn't set up. At that point, I realized, I really should have established that this character smoked because it would have fit the character. Actually, how I see the character, a chain smoker, with a serious nicotine addiction, would have fit the character very well. I'm not a smoker, and it just didn't occur to me because smoking's not as common as it was, in the past. So I didn't want to go through, and I thought about it a little bit. I didn't want to go through and add a bunch of scenes where he's smoking. I could have done it, but it was just I would have the head here and there, and And I already had other things that I'd set up that needed to be paid off, and the story was running a little long. So instead, there was a scene where everything in his pocket gets dumped. Basically, he's getting searched by the cops. So everything in his pocket gets dumped. Well, I said, okay, on the hood of the police car, they put his car keys, his pocket knife, his Zippo lighter, and his pistol magazine, his extra pistol magazine, or whatever it was. I had 3 or 4 things. And I kind of buried the Zippo in the middle there. So I mentioned it, and it was set up now, but it also wasn't flagged like, this will be important. But now no one could say, hey, where'd that Zippo come from? He never had a reason to carry a lighter. And I put a line in there that said, he'd quit smoking a few years earlier, but he still carried the lighter because it came in handy. And then later, it came in handy. So specifically go through your story. Find all your payoffs, make sure they're all set up. Conversely, look at anything that could be considered a setup and make sure it either pays off or that the reader will not expect that it will pay off and then it doesn't. There could be things that you're not really planning to pay off that are just an interesting character quirk or a neat piece of gear they have or something or part of the plot element, but if it never pays off, the reader might feel gypped. The classic example of this is The Simpsons. When they introduce Poochie to the Itchy and Scratchy cartoon world, they have this episode where Itchy and Scratchy are driving to the fireworks factory. And if you've ever seen Itchy and Scratchy, it's a parody of those violent cartoons we all loved as a kid, or at least I loved as a kid. And you know that Itchy and Scratchy at a fireworks factory is going to be, it's going to be a blast. So Poochie's here, and they introduce Poochie, and he gives a little song and a jingle, and hey, I'm so cool, I'm Poochie. And they end the episode, and they never go to the fireworks factory. And Milhouse is like, but what about the fireworks factory? Don't do that to your readers. If you've got a setup, pay it off. Okay? Okay, let's talk about character arcs. Character arc is related to theme. Your characters should have an arc. Not necessarily every character, but your main characters. And an arc is a growth, a change. They should not be the same people at the end of the story that they were at the beginning. That's the story is the story of their change. It doesn't have to be as dramatic, as Luke going from being a farm boy to a aspiring Jedi after he's lost all his family. But there should be something. In Nighthawks, and I'm going to use my own work as a reference, the character arc for Frank is he goes from whether or not he is really a team player or not to being a team player. Okay, not to get to totally spoil the ending, but he goes from not really being a team player to being a team player. And for Tiny, who is a character arc as well, his character arc goes from not really trusting Frank, which is one of the reasons for the antagonism between the two of them, to trusting Frank. Okay? Those two character arcs play into each other. And that, worked out, at least I thought, worked out well. So look at your character, your main character, who may or may not be the viewpoint character. Identify what they look like at the end of the story. Identify what they look like at the beginning of the story. Do you see a change? Is that change supported by their actions and how other characters react to their actions? If it's not, add some supports in there. Prop up that character arc a little. Tone. When I was editing Supernatural Streets, there was one story, I don't want to go into details because I don't want to identify the author, and it was a good story, it's in the book. But in an early draft, there was just a tonal shift. It's actually a reasonably funny story. But there was a scene near the beginning, which is really where you are setting the tone, that was very dark. And when you have that kind of thing near the beginning, you're setting the tone for the whole story. And then it shifts to more of a comedy, only the shift was like shifting a car without putting the clutch in. And boy, that's a dated reference, but some of you will know what I mean. I mean, you could kind of metaphorically hear the gears grinding there. So the writer and I worked it out. I mean, it was not a big deal. I said, you know, this is, for where you're going in this story, this is really kind of dark here up front. And he goes, really? I didn't think so. He says, I go, well, yeah, you know, you're establishing this like a horror story, pretty much. And then it's a light comedy. I said, have you ever read any British mysteries like Agatha Christie or seen Murder, She Wrote? And he's like, oh yeah, I've read Agatha Christie and I've seen Murder, She Wrote. I said, okay, they're both examples of a cozy mystery, and they generally have a light tone. I said, when was the last time that Jessica Fletcher stumbled across a corpse that was ripped limb from limb with severed body parts and entrails all over the room? He goes, never. I go, and there's a reason for that. I said, they're murder mysteries, but they're cozy murders. They're comfortable. People are dead, but they're not violently gory dead. You know, same thing with the Agatha Christie mysteries. You know, there's murders, but it's like, oh, drank the poison tea and turned purple and keeled over. Not, you know, his head exploded. He goes, okay. He says, I think I see what you're saying. He says, let me do another pass on that segment, and let me know what you think. And he did, and he got what I was saying. And it's like, okay, this now fits the tone much better than the previous version. And I would have accepted the story before, or at least I think I would, but it was jarring. And that story, it's funny in that book, we in the reviews, we've had almost every story in the book, someone has said, that's my favorite story, which I think it says something. And that story was several people's favorite. And they called it a comedy, and it worked as a comedy, and it was intended as a comedy. It's just that jarring horror movie tone at the beginning really, I think would really have thrown people off, because it really threw me off. Okay. Action. By action, I mean what your characters think, what they do, their internal dialogue, their external dialogue, their actions. It doesn't have to be car crashes and gunfights. Now, I love car crashes and gunfights. You can have car crashes and gunfights, but that's not the only thing that's action. I'm talking about what your characters do. Whatever the action is, even if it's them brushing their teeth, make sure it's relevant to the story and that it's interesting. And if you really work at it, you could make an interesting scene with a character brushing and flossing his teeth. I mean, you could do it as a writing challenge. You know, the easy way out would be not to, but you could do it. So whatever their action is, make it interesting. If it's not interesting, if it's boring to the reader, either rewrite it until it's interesting, summarize it instead. Just say he brushed his teeth, you know, and got dressed. Or just cut it entirely. Do we need to know that he brushed his teeth? No, we just kind of assume he brushed his teeth. It's not a payoff for anything later. Well, then it doesn't really need to be set up. Okay, then cut it. Again, this is where that idea that it might be in your head, but it might not be on the page pops up. I had a couple action scenes in Nighthawks that in the first draft that I let the beta reader read fell a little flat. And they were both cases where the things were in my head that I didn't put on the page. In the first, it was where the character was physically in the world and his immediate surroundings. And that related to how he got out of a particular, basically he was bound, and how he got out of it. Because the character's like, I couldn't really visualize how he was doing what he was doing, because I thought he was hanging upside down from a tree or something. And, you know, then I'm reading more, and it's like, oh no, I guess he's on level ground. Okay. It was confusing. And in my mind, I knew he was laying on the floor of a forest and not hanging from a tree, but it didn't come across. So I revised it, made it more clear. And then at the action scene at the end, you know, the climax of the story, he's like, that was anticlimactic. He goes, I know that was the big bad, and, you know, the good guys win, but it was like, and there's the bad guy, and there's a little bit of gunfire, and we kill it, and it's over. I said, well, what do you think it needs? He says, well, you don't really describe the big bad that much. You give, like, just a very, very brief description. He says, you don't need to give pages and pages, but a little bit more. And he says, and maybe a little bit more description of the action, you know, just not so much of a summary. And I realized what I'd done is something I'm going to talk about later. Is I was such in a hurry to finish the story that I kind of summarized the action at the end instead of actually playing it out. So look at your action. Make sure you describe your scenes well enough for people to visualize them in their mind, that the action is interesting, that it's compelling, that people will want to read it and want to know how it ends. Okay. Don't be afraid of spectacle. Spectacle and real life are not always the same thing. In real life, things are kind of boring. In fiction, they shouldn't be. If you're writing fiction and you're boring the reader, you're doing it wrong. Okay? I'm sorry, you're doing it wrong. So don't be afraid of spectacle. I mean, sometimes you need a wizard riding a dinosaur through Chicago. And anyone who's read that will know immediately what I'm talking about. It sticks in your mind, the spectacle. Okay? Now I'm going to talk about two of the most important things in your story. The beginning and the end. I spend more time on the beginning of the story than I do anything else. This is one of those places where it's easy to fall into the trap of revising and revising and revising those first few paragraphs. I've had to force myself to not do that until I get the whole draft done. Then I go and I polish and I work and I rewrite those first few paragraphs. But at first, when I first started getting back into fiction, I had this block where I had to get the beginning perfect before I could move on to the rest of the story. And that took me a while to overcome. Because I understood from all my years of news writing that you need a strong lead. You need to draw the reader in right away. Okay? So, the beginning is more important than the ending. Slightly. Because an ending that leaves people flat is bad too. But the beginning, if they get to the ending and they're left a little flat, they read the whole story. The beginning, if they're not drawn in the first few hundred words, they're not going to finish it. They're going to close the book and walk away. They're going to read another story if it's an anthology. If it's a novel, they're not even going to try to read it. You got to get them hooked. So the concrete writing tips I can give you for the beginning, and I've seen this again and again, is edit it to make it shorter and tighter, and start the action sooner. Now, there is a concept, and it is valid, that you need to show the person's previous life before the change in their life that the story talks about. And I'm going to go back to a universal touchstone here, Star Wars. We need to see Luke's life before, so we can understand the journey that he's going on. That's one of the reasons in a scene that was later deleted, they had Luke at a cantina with his best friend Biggs and Biggs' girlfriend, and Luke was, before that, Luke actually saw the space battle through his macro binoculars. All of that was Lucas's attempt to show Luke's previous life, his normal, before all the events that would change his life. When they put the movie together, they realized that was pushing the actual action of the movie, the start of the action of the movie, further and further back. So even though they were good scenes, they cut them. They were ruthless. They cut those scenes entirely. You don't meet Biggs, so there's a payoff later when he meets Biggs at the Rebel base. It's like, Biggs! And, you're my friend, Biggs! And they've referenced Biggs several times. Well, the setup is gone because you never meet Biggs. Okay? Or the setup is incomplete because they reference them but you never meet them. But eliminating that setup was still worth it in order to get the action going. Okay? So, the two things for start of the stories are edit it to make it shorter. That's almost universal. I mean, that could be just generic advice. Put a quarter in, that's what I'm going to tell you. And start the action as close to the beginning of the story as you can. So specifically read, say, your first 500 words. Imagine you're the editor that's deciding whether or not to buy this story or this novel. Well, with a novel, you can make it the first chapter. But for a short story, let's say first 500 words. Imagine you're the editor that's going to buy it. Look at it with their eye. Are you really drawn into the story within 500 words? If you're not, they're going to just... Okay, I'm back. I'm sorry, my camera automatically shut off for some reason, but I'm back. Okay, we're talking about endings. Oh, I'm sorry, we're talking about beginnings. My mistake. I got confused by the camera shutting off. Now we're talking about endings. I learned a lot about a proper ending to a story when I edited the Supernatural Streets book. We had 14 authors, including myself. We had 14 stories. We picked, the best 14 stories out of everything that was submitted. Several of the stories had weak endings in their drafts that were submitted. And I gotta say, including mine, it wasn't until I had a beta reader read it that I realized that my ending fell flat. And why? I looked at other stories that came in, and several of them were good, solid stories, but the endings just kind of fell flat for various reasons. I think part of that is when you're writing a story and you have that energy and that excitement and you're working on it, sometimes when you get near the end, you start to peter out a little and you want to wrap it up. Because several of the problems I saw with endings, including my own, were they kind of summarize what's happening rather than show it. Or they have an ending that's shown, but it's not dramatic. It lacks a certain flair. It doesn't have to be the world exploding, but if the ending of Star Wars would have been, we got the Death Star plans, now we can figure out how we're going to attack this thing. Good work, guys, and that's the end. Is that a little less dramatic than, we just blew up the Death Star? Okay, and that goes back to what I talked about earlier. Don't be afraid to have a little spectacle. Blowing up the Death Star was a spectacle. Okay, it happened at the climax of the movie. Don't let your climax be anticlimactic. Have a solid ending. So, besides just the action that happens and whether or not it's climatic, look at your theme again. Is your theme expressed in the ending? In Nighthawks, the theme of my story is succinctly summed up in the very last words of the last sentence. And that covered the theme, the character arc for Tiny, and the character arc for Frank. All three of those things are wrapped up in the last sentence of the story. And I had several comments. It's like, that ending was perfect. You nailed it. Okay? At first I didn't. It took some work to get there. Now, do you need an epilogue? End the story as close to the end of the action as you can. Okay? But that doesn't necessarily mean you end the story right at the climax of the action. Once again, Star Wars, the story doesn't end. The action ends when the Death Star blows up. The story goes on for a little while longer, and then the epilogue, essentially, is the medal ceremony. Okay? In Nighthawks, I actually have a short epilogue after the climax, and that's where that one-sentence ending comes in. Do not be like the Lord of the Rings movies. The last Lord of the Rings movie had, I think, 5 endings. Yeah, there were a lot of characters, and they wanted to wrap up all their stories, and they were basing it on the books. But you sat through the ending of the trilogy 5 separate times. That was one of the cases where diverging from the books, I think, would have been a good choice. I mean, they did diverge from the books. They didn't have the scourging of the Shire. Okay, when you're done with all this, hey, congratulations. You know what you can do now? The polish pass. Now that you've gone through and you've got your theme established, and you've looked at your character arcs, and you've made sure your action scenes are good, your character action's good, you've got some spectacle in there, something interesting, everything's wrapped up, you've got a solid draft, now you can go through and polish it. This is where you could do more rerunning on that beginning to get that beginning nice and tight. This is where you can go through and fix some awkward language that you noticed, in your many rereadings. This is where you can basically fix all the spelling mistakes and grammar mistakes, and you'll never fix them all, but you'll catch most of them. And this is when, if you already haven't sent it out, because you could really send it out before this, this is when you can send it out to the beta readers. That wraps it up. Since this is a pre-recorded presentation, I'm obviously not going to have, a Q&A on video here. But what I'll do instead is, if you put your questions in the comments, I will respond. I may be online when this airs. If not, as soon as I can afterwards, I'll respond. And I believe my email is connected to my YouTube account, so you can always feel free to email me. So thank you very much, and hopefully we'll see you at Penguicon next year.